My name is Mark Jansen. I'm professor of history here at Bethel. My first introduction to tonight's speaker, Dr. Keith Sprunger, was in his History of Civ classes when I was a student here. Although I'm a history professor, oddly enough, I was not a history major as an undergrad. So I had to take the first class. It was a required history class. Then voluntarily I signed up for the second one because I enjoyed history and Keith's teaching style so much. Last night, for those of you who were here, you heard Keith talk about Bethel and its origins as a light in the West and its connections around the world and especially to Europe. It reminded me that Keith, in his many years of teaching here, played an instrumental role in keeping those connections alive. He led his first study tour and interterm to the Soviet Union in 1973 and led many subsequent trips to Europe, introducing a great many students to that part of the world. When I was doing research on the history of Mennonite Central Committee's involvement in Eastern Europe, Bethel's activities there, which would be the tours led by Cornelius Krahn and by Keith Sprunger, were listed as some of the earliest efforts by Mennonites to reach out across the Iron Curtain in a time of Cold War. An important chapter, I think, in Mennonite history and American history, and Bethel College played a small role in that. Tonight, Keith is going to talk to us about Bethel College in the 1960s. My own memories of the 1960s were mostly of watching Captain Kangaroo, so I'm looking forward eagerly to learn more about that decade. Please join me in welcoming Keith Sprunger.
Thank you. Well, good evening. For some of us of a certain age, the 1960s bring back many memories. It is a historical period of note. It was that way also for Bethel College. Russell Mast was pastor of the Bethel College Church during the 1960s, and he told me once that the 1960s was the period when Mennonites came face to face with modernity, and they made the most amiable adjustment to modernity in their history. As he implied, this was an age of modern radicalism, critical thinking, and spiritual decline. And in his view, these developments, although perhaps inevitable for us, were not very good. I call it the crucial decade. Hasn't every decade been critical for Bethel College? This one stands out in particular in its institution-changing events and Bethel's near demise. But it was also the period when I arrived at Bethel College. So that's, again, why it stands out. Now, tonight, I'm wearing a special tie my flower-powered tie that I bought in 1967 when on my first research trip to London. And I used to wear it once a year in my classes when I would lecture on the 1960s. And I wear it again tonight in honor of that great period. Now for Bethel, I think we should think of two phases of the 1960s. There was, at first, a quiet beginning. If we think of the 60s as the era of radicalism, revolution, demonstrations, counter-demonstrations, war, anti-war activities, and so on, that was not the way the decade started in regard to Bethel College. In 1960, things dawned here rather quietly and conventionally. In 1960, Bethel brought in an outside consultant to make a study in preparation for a fund drive. And he analyzed what had happened, what was happening, and likely what would happen. He, however, saw none of those furious storm clouds on the horizon. As he saw it, Bethel was a good, solid, and unexciting college. Its academic program was rather conventional. Lots of textbooks and recitations, lots of 3-hour and 5-hour classes in our quarter system at the time. The faculty is almost exclusively Mennonite. Three-fourths of them are alumni of the college. They are well trained. 34% hold the PhD degree. Student campus life is wholesome, constructive, and Christian. There is a healthy, generally happy atmosphere. Students do not seem to have any resentment toward or even question regarding the authority of the administration in disciplinary problems or matters involving student life. All is calm. In regard to financial positions, Bethel is conservative and even austere. Overall, Bethel, because of its Mennonitism, said this consultant, was unusual, but for many, it will seem to be little more than an average Midwestern credits and points centered liberal arts college. Its architecture in appearance is pleasant, but obviously has little relevance. But Bethel possibly has some promise if it can emphasize the unique Bethel College idea. And in his judgment, the thing most needed was to bring new life and power to the educational program. Everything is solid, everything is so quiet. And then he said, I covet a little greater measure of excitement. Good news. Excitement is on the way. The 60s are on the way. And so we proceed onward. Phase 1, the early 60s. At this point, Vernon Neufeld was president. He served as president from 1960 to 1966. Maybe we should call it the Neufeld-Meyer period. Albert Meyer was academic dean during that first phase of the 60s and played a large role. Esco Lowen was dean of students. During the first half of the 60s, the emphasis at Bethel was on strengthening the academic program, building buildings, and enhancing the college's reputation nationally as a good liberal arts college. College athletics, this program was de-emphasized. The Neufeld-Meyer administration also developed a unique Anabaptist Mennonite religious program based on the seminar or close fellowship concept. And maybe some of you who are here tonight would remember being involved in those seminars, meeting on Sunday mornings or Wednesday evenings in order to develop the close-knittedness of the church on campus. Neufeld possessed a kind of natural dignity and gravitas and set the tone for this period of college stability and substantial enhancement. Attracted by this sense of new ideas, momentum, fresh thought, new faculty came in, some of whom served for many years and even for decades. And I run my mind back over some of those who came at that particular time. And I'll just list some of these. They'll be familiar, many of these, to you. Long-term faculty who arrived in the 60s. Robert Schmidt, Bob Regier, Paul Friesen, James Yunke, Anna Yunke, John Sheriff, Howard Snyder, Richard Rempel, Wayne Weens, Emerson Weens, Wesley Pauls, Alvin Beachy, Arlo Casper, Ada Mae Howery. And I also think of some such as Alvin Allen, Delbert Friesen, Orville Penner, Gene Wadle, Paul Harms, and my colleague across the hall that first year, Omer Ghali. So the new forces arrived. Now, Dean Albert Meyer stated that in looking for new faculty, we're not just looking at folks to fill slots. We want standout people, teachers who combine scholarly promise, intellectual excitement, and the ability to light a fire in the classroom. Did we all measure up? As one of the new faculty reflected to me in an interview as a part of our college history program, this new leadership of Neufeld and Meyer, both with Princeton degrees, attracted him. They inspired us and promised change. Now there was a second phase, we'll call it the late 60s. We got a new president and an entirely new phase of national and college life. Academic deans were Justice Holsinger and William Keeney, and Milton Gehring became Dean of Students. This is the period when college events nationally and at Bethel really heated up, producing much of that long-sought campus excitement. Now, the late 60s were not an easy time to be a college president. And for some teachers, not an easy time to be a teacher either, although I must say it was never dull. John Thielen, who has written a history of higher education, wrote this about being a college administrator. The norm for presidents of this late 60s period was early retirement, heart attacks, and disbelief that these contentious student groups, numerically so small, had come to exert such a disproportionate influence. Fortunately, this description does not exactly fit Bethel's experience, but it does fit in some ways. Orville Voth later reflected, "At Bethel as president, I endured vandalism and threats of violence. Once someone threw explosives against my front door, and another time we found a dummy with a bloody dagger on our front porch. I got threatening phone calls, 'Better take care of your family.' Those were negative times," he said. That was a tough time to be president. The transition into this radical period did not happen all at once. And here I want to show you a favorite picture of mine. Those of you who were here in the 60s, do you remember the briefcase period? We didn't have backpacks in those days. We carried briefcases with handles. And that way you could carry not only your notebooks, but your Merriam-Webster dictionary and all these other things you might need in case some reference item came up. And then as you would move from point to point, or maybe it was time to go to chapel, rather than lug that whole thing, we would just set them down along the sidewalk. And the whole sidewalk would be lined with these briefcases. And then you'd come back later on, everything would be safe there. You'd pick them up and go on along your way. Escaloan once mentioned that there had been a bit of theft in one of the dormitories. He said, "I'm worried about theft." But some of the students who came from out on the East Coast said, "Look at this, you got nothing to worry about." Well, we continued, I think, in a strong academic thrust going into the late 60s, but there was already some erosion from the hard habits of study. And there's a transition taking place in terms of what was considered to be most important: good grades, hard study, or being involved. Now, Alan Tycrow, who enrolled at Bethel in 1965, described 1967 as for him the time when Bethel seemed to have reached a turning point. This was not only because of national events which were taking place across the country, but because of Peace Club activity and the growth of more extreme and even radical ideas that were coming into the campus and were being accepted by students more widely. As a sign of the changing times, Tycrow recalled when Richard Friesen, student council president, is Richard here this evening? I think I saw him come in 1967 spoke in convocation on the topic student power. Tycrow said that interested him very much, but he said before that time, hardly any student could even have contemplated such a speech, let alone given it. Richard, isn't it comforting to know that a speech you gave 45 years ago was still remembered? That's what I call powerful speaking, powerful thinking. Well, Tycrow said that was just a kind of a sign. It wasn't that Richard changed things. Richard was in tune with the national movements and student power, and giving a speech like that was something that our consultant in 1960 could not have conceived of. This speech and the convo forum that followed it were examples of the tilt that had occurred in a rather short time. By the end of the decade, the tilt had become very pronounced, and Bethel in some regards was a very different school. The change may not have been so obvious since all of our surrounding schools were also undergoing change and we were all moving with the times. So you didn't, if you measure yourself with other schools, that was one thing. If you measure yourself against what we had been several years before, then again, that was another matter. Locally, these changes were driven by an ever more assertive faculty, which organized itself into an AAUP chapter, American Association of University Professors. So the faculty was more assertive, and some would say rather troublemaking. And there was an ever more assertive student body who was operating, collecting ideas from being in touch with the national student power movement, and some ideas were attractive that were involved, were drawn from the more radical aspects of Anabaptism. I want to mention now some of these areas of change that came about in the 60s. We have to be rather brief about this because so much happened and so little time tonight. Academic changes. Students initiated reforms which included such matters as pass-fail grading, course evaluation by students, and demands for classes to be relevant. Students asked for shared authority. At the beginning of a history class, Jim Yunke, my colleague, got a bit of a jolt when one of the students spoke up and said, "Mr. Yunke, could you tell us why you think you have the authority to decide what you're going to study in this class?" Another area of change had to do with the diversity of the student body. In 1960, the student body in the college and student body and faculty was predominantly Mennonite, probably at least 75%, and overwhelmingly products of small town, Midwestern or farm communities. By 1970, although the number of Mennonites was still substantial, we had newer elements that had come in. Now in 1960, we had an important event on campus which was commemorated a couple of years ago, the visit by Dr. Martin Luther King, speaking at Bethel about the future of integration. This helped to call attention to civil rights and race issues. During the 1960s, the college made a more determined effort to bring in a wider range of students. And this involved bringing in people from new places, sending student admissions counselors to larger cities like Chicago or out east, and visiting and inviting people in. Bringing in larger numbers of African Americans, some Hispanics, some Asians, a few Native Americans. So we got more of a mix, both of urban as well as rural people, and there was a much greater mix along racial and ethnic lines. One of those who came was George Rogers, African American student from Chicago. He graduated in 1969 and joined the Bethel faculty and had a career of almost 30 years here in teaching, coaching, and eventually as dean of students. Overall, the next decade had an ever larger number of African Americans, and this grew to be about, well, by the end of the 70s, about 10% of the student population. But not all of these student careers were as successful as George Rogers. Although the increased enrollment in numbers was welcomed, the new diversity was not an easy fit for Bethel. And one former student of the 60s, an African American student, gave me some of these comments. I would have used them in our new book, but they came in a little later than already we were at the press. And so I asked him if it'd be all right if I would use some of these things in my lecture on the 60s. And he arrived in the 60s and graduated in the early 70s. And here are some of the things that he reflected on about being one of these new students at Bethel. He said, "The biggest discovery I made was that of being an African American at an all-white school." It was not quite all white, but predominantly all white when he arrived. "And being of the same religious belief, being a Christian, but not being accepted really as a member of that faith. Black students were perceived as being different. Black students then banded together for security and out of fear of the necessity of not being welcomed or accepted by the Bethel community. This was the first time I had knowingly encountered isolation and rejection from a particular group. I spent my first year at Bethel trying to survive all the new social changes which I had never encountered before." And so he gives another examples along this line and says, you know, there were a larger number of people coming in, many of them, a great many of them, transfers from junior colleges and had come for athletic, to be on the sports teams. Only about 10% of those people ever graduated from Bethel. He said he didn't feel we had the programs to really help them move through. We didn't have the support system. He says, "I look back on the fact that Bethel had no support system. It begs a question to be asked by me, and that question is, should it have had a support system for those students?" But he said he was determined not to be one of those dropouts. He said, I was motivated and I was going to complete Bethel, and indeed he did successfully. "At the time of my graduation, I was the only black member of my cohort who had been with me at the beginning. I was the only one left with the AB degree. One person finished with an AA degree." Well, there's more here to it, and it has given me a lot to think about as I've pondered on this. I feel that I wish Bethel had been more welcoming. I wish I had known more what to do. I think we were just really not very well prepared for this influx of new people. I think people's intentions were good, but I don't think we were very skillful in achieving that. Now, meanwhile, there was this rising interest in civil rights and racial justice. And Bethel students were joining delegations to go to Birmingham, Alabama, and other southern locations in support of Dr. Martin Luther King and racial desegregation. These trips were, I think, well-intentioned, but as we look back, there was some irony in going south to help solve southern racial problems when we had our own problems here in Kansas, and we often didn't recognize that particular matter. Let's look at another area of change during this crucial decade, the peace activities of the 60s. The Bethel Peace Club was the leader in anti-Vietnam War activity, and this is the most famous phase of activism of the time. Do some of you remember the Repentance Walk-in Mail of 1966? Notice how neat everybody is at this point, yet we're still in the neat period. Suits and ties, and the plan here was to walk to the Newton post office and mail letters to our congressman in Washington asking for the end of the war. Because of threats against the planned demonstration, the plan was changed to walk only to the North Newton post office. But I think this really launched Bethel in its era of peace activism and gave quite a bit of publicity. (1969), the National Moratorium Day and the famous bell ringing. This was the point where the bell was tolled, I believe, every 4 seconds to mark each of the American dead in Vietnam, and that went on for about 4 days. There was much radio, TV, newspaper, and magazine coverage for Bethel. Here we have one of the Bethel Peace Club people ringing in the bell. Here was our coverage in Life magazine. Bethel gained that 15 minutes of fame that Andy Warhol said we're all deserving of. Look at that serious nature of the students. This is not just fun and games. This is changing the world. Maybe you recognize some of these folks. (1970), Jim Youngke ran a campaign as a peace candidate for election to Congress. And this recruited and brought quite a bit of student support. This was not an activity of the Peace Club, but strongly connected with it and had a lot of support on campus. Jim was an iron man at that point because he was running a campaign and teaching half-time here at the same time. I don't see how he kept it all going, and ran a very credible campaign, although it was not elected. I next want to turn to another area of change, social change at Bethel. Now, in some ways, we're out changing the world, but what about changing right here on campus? Students asked for something called change. That was a word I heard so much about, change. They asked for, in fact, I think demanded more freedom. I remember asking one nonconformist student, "What are your goals? What are you doing?" "I'm into lifestyle," he said. The great mantras of the time, I think, were these: no more in loco parentis. Our students, classically oriented, were able to use Latin. No more in loco parentis, and more student power. Campus rules and regulations loosened considerably during the 60s. Bethel brought in dancing, on-campus smoking in special dorm smoking rooms, and there were relaxed rules in dormitories and pretty much an abandoning of the dress code. Such things as the prohibition on wearing blue jeans to classes and having all the proper kind of costume. There was, however, no change in the campus alcohol ban. That is not by the rules, but maybe in the practice. Now let's look a little bit at some of these changes in campus rules and regulations. Here, this is the one I want now. We'll come back to the flying a little bit later. Here are some parts of the dress code from 1966, 1967 about what to wear on campus. And this was substantially there all through the 60s in the official guidebook. For girls, you would wear skirts, blouses, sweaters, jumpers, and casual dresses. For class, footwear would be flats, hose, loafers, and socks. Now for church and concerts, dressy dresses, heels, hose. You'll also need hats and gloves. For banquets, a party dress for the lighter one, and for real formal things, you'll need at least one real formal. Boys, for classes, you'll be wearing slacks, shirts, sweaters. For shoes, you'll use loafers or saddles. And for church and other dress occasions, suit, white shirt, and tie. Never wear blue jeans. This is for boys and girls both. Never wear blue jeans for class. Blue jeans are universally frowned upon for classroom wear. Now, what could have been more totally out of step with reality than this sort of stuff cranked out of the Dean of Students' office when the world was changing before all of our eyes, and all of these things were matters of the past, of the past era, trying to live in the new era. Terry Unruh was student body president in 1969-70, and I think the next year as well. Now, Terry did an interesting thing in 1969. He brought out his own supplemental student guide, which told you the real story about Bethel College. He said, this is what you're hearing from the Dean of Students, but this is really what we do. The Supplemental Bethel Student Guide by Terry Unruh. I won't read the entire thing, but it goes something like this. Just because there is a lengthy dress code in the handbook does not mean that that's what people wear. Don't expect to see slacks and sports shirts or sweaters for boys and skirts, blouses, jumpers, sweaters, or casual dresses for girls in the classroom. It's not going to happen. The guide advises that full participation in college life demands a varied wardrobe. You'll soon discover that you can participate fully in any phase of college life with the necessary time, energy, creativity, and dungarees. Your ideas are what's important, not your dress. And then he commented about something else in the student guide, and that was Leap Weekend, where girls would ask the boys for dates, and this would reverse. Terry said this is a perennial flop. It's not going to happen, and this was his analysis. Girls refuse to assume boys' role because they feel the boys refuse to assume the boys' role by refusing the girls' role. Terry was a philosophy major. He managed to make that in such a way I still don't know what he was saying. He also had some very interesting advice here, especially for the girls, if they would arrive back to the dorm after the doors were locked. And he told you how to get around the rules and where you might find safe harbor in case of, in other words, here's the real story of Bethel College. This is the social revolution order. Remember that consultant said, oh, the students are very placid. They just go along with everything. Well, Terry told you how you didn't have to go along with everything. Faculty attire also began to drift in that same direction, and we began to see much longer hair and beards and what have you, and sloppy clothes and even jeans. I met someone here over Fall Fest who told me, said, I was the first guy who wore blue jeans to class. I think he wanted maybe a special acclamation for that. If I'd known it in time, I could have included it in the book, but I hadn't been aware of it before. President Voth in 1970 reported to the board that long hair and scruffy clothing was becoming the new normal on campus for students, and even for some faculty. But so far, he said, we have no barefooted faculty, although he implied that probably was soon to come. I want to come back here to the Fly, the underground student newspaper, which was the culmination of student activism and dissent. This high point of activism and dissent, I think, was found in the student underground newspaper called The Fly, put out by a group of alienated students between 1968 and 1970. The Fly had a very sharp message, and this message was this: students must oppose and resist the fascist oppression at the national level represented by President Nixon, and two, they must oppose and resist the oppression at Bethel as illustrated by President Voth. Now, that was the Fly, and I'm commenting that President Voth was a very hardworking president, had a great love of Bethel. However, students did not take to him easily, and there was always a certain amount of tension. And among the complaints against him was this: he wore a crew-cut haircut. Somehow that was considered unforgivable. Some of the student editors and writers were anonymous in The Fly because they said it was feared that the Bethel power structure will not be sympathetic. But several of the writers actually used their own names and spoke openly about their concerns. This opens the very interesting topic of anonymous student underground newspapers, and I spoke somewhat about that in convocation this morning about student newspapers, underground newspapers, and gave some other examples. But I think that's all I'll say about underground newspapers now, except to say they were here, and they played quite a role. And I remember how we would find them on stacks papers or slipped under our doors, and we'd arrive in the morning, there would be the fly, and we would quickly read through it to see if we were slammed by name or whether we had escaped through another issue. By the end of the decade, 1970, Bethel then was considerably changed. President Voth resigned in the spring of 1970, and the changes piled up in academic program, the diversity of the student body, and in social attitudes and practices of students, and to some extent of faculty as well. No longer a sheltered Kansas Mennonite enclave, Bethel had gone modern. It had joined the national academic and social revolutions. There were, however, some serious consequences. Enrollment fell. By 1970, enrollment was down to about 470. That was down almost 150 over the decade, with very serious implications for the budget. Financial support from churches and community was also very much reduced. Income from tuition was much reduced. The college was running in the red, and the board set up a secret school closing committee that was to operate in the likelihood that Bethel would go bankrupt and would have to close. All of these events of that committee were kept very secret because they did not want to harm morale more than it already was sinking. Fortunately, that committee could be disbanded and never really had to go into operation. But I say serious consequences. Financial, serious consequences in relationship with the city of Newton. These relations became ever more tense. Newtonians did not appreciate student demonstrations and activism which riled up their peaceful community. Also, relations with Mennonite churches were strained. Although the student body often spoke of demonstrating and marching in the name of Anabaptist ideals, many Mennonites did not resonate with that concept of religion or of Mennonitism. Former President Dr. D.C. Wadle, who had resigned in 1959, returned to the college in the 60s to work in the development office. And he spent a great deal of his time visiting, speaking in Mennonite churches in the Western District. He warned that Bethel faced a dire situation with the Western District Mennonite churches. Bethel College, he told us in a memo, has lost about 1/2 of the Western District churches because of the Peace Club. There seemed to be too much running around, too much secularism, and too much hanky-panky. Church people asked Wadle, who runs the college anyhow? Is it radical students and radical professors? Nevertheless, it was the Western District churches that saved the college at this dire time, in spite of some of those misgivings on their part. At a conference, a special conference of the Western District in the fall of 1970 in this very room, the churches, with the support of Conference Minister Albert Kuntz, voted to assume the college debt and give this college another chance. Thus ends a chapter of Bethel history, the 1960s. The next chapter brings us to the story of Harold Schultz and what some called the Bethel Renaissance, but that is for another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. I think we have time for some questions or comments. If someone has a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
People of the 60s are more quiet than they were back in those days.
I have one question. If the committee was secret, how did you find out about it?
Historical ingenuity. I didn't know about it at the time. I didn't learn about it until one of the members of that committee, Walter Clausen, wrote a memoir about his life, and he said, he'd been involved with Bethel College. He said, one of the things I was on that secret committee. And that was the first time I saw that in print. So thank you, Walter, for uncovering something for us. It makes us realize that we were really close to the cliff there at that time. I think most of us didn't realize we were maybe dangling by that much of a thread. Here from 1949 to 1953.
I thought maybe I'd shout, but I was a student from 1949 to 1953. I don't remember any dress codes or anything like that. When did that come in?
Well, I guess that's a good question. I'm not sure when maybe they didn't need a dress code. Maybe everybody just dressed in a proper fashion at that time. I'm kind of thinking that maybe that was a part of this elevating of the college image that was going on in the early 60s. And in order to make us look more respectable, to assume that all of our students wore hats and gloves to class and so on. I don't know, that's just a kind of a guess. If you think if there was no expectation, then when did it come in? I'm not sure about the answer on that. We have all the student guides, and one can look back on them, but other people, were there dress codes? Were there standards if you were here in the earlier times? Yeah, Dwayne.
Well, I was here from 1958 to 62 as a student, and I remember a group of Goering Hall students organizing a march with drums that they wanted to wear jeans and t-shirts, and they were opposed to this uppity kind of needing to dress up. So there was already some signs of diversity then, and I don't recall myself that there was a dress code for men, but my spouse says there was for women.
Now, would you have felt comfortable wearing blue jeans to class, or was that sort of an unspoken?
I didn't, but I don't recall that being an issue for me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we got a comment back there. We need can we have a little more light in this room so we can see each other? Turn up the lights. Good, now we're enlightened.
I was in the same graduating class as Dwayne. We were not allowed to attend, that is, men were not allowed to go to the library and work in the library wearing shorts, nor were we allowed to go to the dining hall wearing shorts. I remember my senior year, I was staying at Gossel Hall, and we organized a very self-conscious protest. All of us, the entire hall, put on shorts and went to the dining hall and with a challenge. Would they serve us or not? And we got served. I didn't own a pair of shorts. I had to borrow some shorts for the event.
How cool can you be? I have a story from Emerson Weens telling about going over to the library one evening with a fellow student. She was in slacks, and Leona Crable turned her away, saying, we don't have that kind of thing here at the library. So I guess Miss Crable maybe did more of a police role than Miss Will did at the dining hall. I can believe that would be the case. Yes.
Did you find a change in the level of academic rigor in that period in the 60s? And did it continue? Does it represent kind of a watershed period in that regard?
Well, I believe that the academic standards of Bethel rose during the 60s under the efforts of President Neufeld and President and Dean Meyer. Neufeld came in with saying, standards should be raised. He was an exponent of higher academic standards, and he wanted to see those applied across the way. And there was a kind of sense that Bethel could become really a kind of standout college in Kansas. One of the people who joined us in administration said, I saw Bethel as the rising Harvard of Kansas. That's what I wanted to be involved with. And Bethel put a lot of emphasis then in preparing students for national fellowships and had extraordinary success in students winning national Woodrow Wilson fellowships, Danforth fellowships. It had the highest record of any other school in Kansas, and even per capita higher than any of the state universities. And so we had a lot of very bright students. The student body potentially was very good. And if they were challenged, and I think the quality, I know in history, the quality of research was excellent. And that continued on pretty well through the 60s. I think really we did some of the finest work. Then I think as we get into the early 70s, there became a kind of weariness for students who said, well, we want some alternative kinds of learning, more inner-directed, student-directed things, and that sort of led education into some other different reforms. But I think during the 60s, there was definitely a rise of the academic quality of student work at Bethel. That's my tribute to all you Bethel students of the 60s. Great students. Good memories. Yeah, Marvin.
I came on the board, I think it was in about '69, representing Western District Conference, which was during that critical time. And when the secret committee was functioning, though I was not on the secret committee, but as I recall, they looked seriously at alternatives to what the college could become. And one of them was becoming a community college and with greater ownership from the community. And I think the Western District calling the special session was critical. My question is, did you sense that Western District Conference meeting and taking ownership of the college, did that change much at the college itself?
Yes, it did. Personally, it did. I went into that meeting wondering whether I should be looking for another position. After that conference, I felt there was a future for Bethel, and I think that was somewhat the spirit across the faculty, and I think it led to a kind of renewal that yes we can do it, and of course the search for a new president. There was quite a bit of excitement about a new president. So I think that was a key factor for me personally, and I think it was for many people. The idea of alternatives to Bethel, that really had kind of a frightening sound to it, because it wasn't the Bethel that most of us had felt called to come to when they were saying, well, should we become a community college, maybe a 2-year college, or should we become Newton, something run by a board of Newtonians, and become more of just a general Midwestern city college. Or there was the idea that was kind of popular at the time, the Conrad Grable method, and that was for moving the heart of the sort of a key component to one of the state universities, such as Conrad Grable had been set up at the University of Waterloo. Should we move a core of faculty, close up here, and move a core to WSU or to K-State or University of Kansas? And I know at that Western District Conference, that was even suggested there, that some things, instead of saving this college, maybe we ought to be looking at some of these other alternatives. So there were a lot of things on the table then, but Bethel continued on, and I love Bethel, and I'm glad we were able to make that and sort of pull together the different units, bringing together the Newtonians, the churches, and the traditions of Bethel, and giving us new life. I think that happened. We felt low, and then we revived. That's my thought on this.
Yes, more about the 1970 Western District Conference in this room. That really was an extremely crucial meeting of the Western District. You have it in your book, but I think it could have even been given more emphasis. I think there were many points of dissatisfaction that were voiced at that meeting, and I think it was finally realized that somehow there had to be a turn of direction, and there had to be more contact with the churches, and the college had somehow lost contact with many churches, as D.C. Wadle had very correctly observed. And then the new president, Harold Schultz, was able to do that. It, of course, was the intention of Orville Voth to be in contact with the churches. That was certainly his intention all the way along, but somehow it didn't happen, partly because of these so-called revolutionary events that really couldn't be controlled by the administration. So there were lots of forces at play, as you have recalled here, but that was really a crucial turning point, that 1970 Western District Conference. Even after the year after that, the General Conference met at Fresno, and there were people there who said, even to me and to others, that maybe, and these were knowledgeable people, that maybe this is finally the time when maybe Bethel College should end. And these people had no knowledge of a secret committee working in that contingency if that would occur, but it was really a time when the existence of the college was on end, and the renaissance that came after that during the Schultz administration was that much more a blessing and return to strength that we really applauded.
Thank you, Robert. I would agree with you that President Voth had that also in his intention. He wanted to come closer to the churches, but the times really were working against it because there was a pull to move in a more secular direction, and Bethel was pulled in more than one direction. And I still recall President Voth telling the faculty, he said, you ought to find out what it's like to go out to the churches and try to raise money and students when you're acting like this. When you're that was a very difficult thing. And one thing that we should note about the Western District action, the Western District assumed the debt of the college, but they didn't have that money. I think they had to go out and borrow it. Wasn't that the case, that they had to go out and borrow it and then repay it over a period of years? That was a vote of confidence in Bethel College. Not maybe of what we were at that moment, but what we had been and what we could become again.
Keith, I want to go back to the 1960s and ask a question. I note some of the dress code issues, the hours for women, things that were gender specific. Would you comment about the role of women and its effect in the 60s? I note your book and your illustration tonight mentions none. There surely should have been, and I see in the audience, some very strong women's voices in the peace movement for sure. Jan Dick ringing that bell. What about women faculty and women administrators in the 60s?
Well, I did mention Anna Yunke, who came on as a very strong faculty member in the 60s and was the first one to become faculty chair of the faculty after she had been here a time. Edna Kaufman came on the faculty at that point as was revived the home economics department and served as dean of women. We had I mentioned Jean Wadle as an English teacher. Honora Becker was in her later years, and I dealt with Honora more in an earlier chapter because she was beginning to round out her career. So we did have some strong women faculty. They tended to be centered in English, home economics, and physical education. People like Mildred Beecher. I don't remember, other than Edna Kaufman, that we had any women administrators. I think that was something still to come. And The women, the college women were very active in the Peace Club, gave a lot of leadership there, and I think all of our pictures from the bell ringing are of women who kept the bell going. And Kirsten, did you have any men signed up to ring the bell, or was it just the photographers that only wanted to photograph the women? Because all the photographs I have show the women ringing the bell. Maybe that was gender bias among the photographers. But the number of women faculty was very small, granted, and yet among students, I think they were becoming more active. I had students who used to complain, the double standard, that was what I used to hear about, the double standard. The fellas get away with everything, the women are tied down with these rules and need to be liberated. So that's the story. I had some very fine women colleagues at that time, and I just wanted to repeat some of those names to show that we were gaining some of those people, and they played a fine role. Another woman faculty, I didn't mention her because it was rather short term, but Phyllis Bixler came on the faculty the same year that I did, and she was a good addition to the English department, but she stayed only 2 years and then went back to graduate school. Yeah.
I have a question about the faculty, and with the rise of the student activism and seeking change and disruption and everything, how much do the faculty resist that, and how much do they go along with it? So it's kind of secretly saying, good for you kids, you're changing things,
Well, yes and no, to give you a straight answer. The student activism, let's say like the Repentance Walk in Mail, 1960, a nice orderly event, everybody nice, dressly, and so on. A number of faculty took part in that, including Orville Both, the new president. He was on campus that semester as academic dean. He would take office. He was already named president. He would take office at the end of the year. He took part in that event, and so the faculty saw this as maybe a sign that our students were alert, energetic, far-reaching, had social conscience, and there was a feeling that at good colleges the students were doing that sort of thing. So at Bethel, probably that was good that they were doing this kind of thing as well. There was some opposition. Some faculty members thought that this maybe was leading in dangerous directions. Now, my reading of the situation in terms of the faculty was this: as long as these demonstrations were directed outward, there was quite a bit of support for them. The faculty often even took part in them. When the students began to say, "Mr. Yunke, what authority do you have to run this class?" Then the faculty began to say, wait a minute, this is going too far. We want you to be out demonstrating somewhere else. We didn't want you demonstrating so much in the classroom. I think that's where you begin to get a bit of resistance to that and a bit of muttering about the fact that maybe this was going a little bit too far. That's kind of my feeling, that there was a kind of mixture to it. I supported the Peace Club and the Peace Club activities, but when it came into the classroom, I began to sort of pull back just a little bit.
Looking back as a historian for 40-some years later, was this a good thing that the college went through, or a bad thing?
Well, we faced modernity. We faced the times. As I said, it almost ruined us. If hardship is a good thing, then it was a good thing because we experienced that. I would say many of these changes were good changes. I think this necessity to loosen up the academic curriculum, to get some new features into it, to bring more openness, into the educational process. I think we benefited from that. We certainly did. And I would say it was inevitable that we would face those changes. So in that sense, that our students would become involved in the student power movement, and the in loco parentis movement would change us. I think it was good in the sense that since that was what was happening, we would become hopelessly a dinosaur if we had not taken a part of some of those events, and we had to learn to readjust to them and to begin looking at college in new ways. And as far as the time for teaching, that was probably the most exciting part of my college career. You know, I was a very green new teacher. I learned a lot from the students, and I think it made me a better teacher. I think the college learned a lot, but it was a very dangerous step because it moved so fast that it cut us off from some of our roots there and put us in a dangerous position. But we survived. Yes.
Wasn't it maybe important for those things to happen for us to remember our Anabaptist roots and our sense of social justice and conscience and all that? I think that was coming out in all kinds of weird ways, but it was important for later and for now.
It was an awakening. It was an awakening. It was a recovery of certain aspects of our Anabaptist Mennonite history that we hadn't really emphasized for a long time.
The same lines. I was here from 63 to 67, and I remember we studied some of the statements in the catalog alongside Anabaptist statements to make our point of justifying some of our actions and some of like should we be required to go to chapel, for example. We burned our chapel cards in the steps of the ad building. Some of us sent them to the back, our draft cards back, but some were also burning their chapel cards. We saw those things as similar. So.
Yes, Larry, I still remember students ripping that page out of the catalog which talked about our Anabaptist background and taping it to their jackets and so on, you know. We demand freedom, Anabaptist freedom, and using that as a kind of propellant for a much wider element of freedom. Freedom is an interesting word. Well, we've put in more than our usual 50 hours of class. I think we've had a good evening of it. I've showed you my flower power for the year. I'm going to put it away now till another year. Thank you very much for coming. I've enjoyed this chance to get together with many of you. It's good to see all of you again.
Thank you, Keith, for that presentation. And I want to invite you all to come back again tomorrow night at 7:30 for a panel discussion with Keith as the author of the Bethel 125-year anniversary, John Sharp as the author of the Heston College Centennial Anniversary, and Richard Kyle, one of the authors of Tabor College Centennial Anniversary history book. And there'll be a panel discussion of what it's like to write the history book for a Kansas Mennonite college. So please all come back tomorrow night.